Many thanks. I'm delighted to be here talking to you. I was wanting to cover the whole area of maintenance treatments for heroin addiction or opiate addiction, and to look at where we are and how we should be looking at taking it forward. So various declarations, and people can read through the detail afterwards, but it includes working with treatment agencies, government agencies, working with parts of the pharmaceutical industry, working with charities and the like. Just a few minutes about the way in which we present maintenance treatments in professional and public debate is really important, because we need to communicate the fact that we're talking about the provision of treatment to people who have a degree of impairment from their addiction, and the public debate and political and professional debate swings between whether it's a medicine and care approach or is it a law and order approach. And what I'm talking about here is firmly rooted in the medicine and care, the medical approach and care approach. And that affects the language we use to describe the treatments. And it's not exclusive to the opiate field or what would be seen as the drugs field. So the smoking field has clearly established the benefit from nicotine replacement to increase people's parallel efforts to quit smoking. So in the same way, nicotine replacement doesn't stop somebody smoking, but it increases the extent to which they have the ability to achieve what they're trying to achieve. So the 6 areas I'm going to cover quickly in this talk. I'll take you through these one at a time. So first of all, we have two big beasts, or two big products in the addictions field with a strong evidence base and major benefit. Now, that's both a reason to be glad that we have two powerful products in the opiate addiction treatment field, but it's also disappointing that 50 years on, all we have is two products. And it is, to some extent, it demonstrates a degree of lack of attention or discrimination against both the field and the patient population, that there hasn't been that commitment and investment to either improving the existing products or developing a wider range. So it's reason for celebration that we have powerful products, and disappointment that we don't have more. But in making that criticism, I don't want to detract from the huge value and the amount of benefit that is delivered by these treatments, because they have, over at least 50 years, been seen as controversial. They're amongst the most well-tested and well-established treatments that we have in medicine today. What's also interesting is the levels at which the benefit can be seen. So I'm a clinician and a researcher, so as a doctor I see the individual health benefit as being extremely important and what drives the consideration of treatment. And there are huge health gains associated with the maintenance treatments that I'm going to be summarizing. But there's also enormously important public health benefit around HIV and Hep C and overdose risk. And there's also a public security issue to do with breaking the drug crime link. So the identikit picture of the individual for whom maintenance treatment might offer benefit is someone obviously who's opiate dependent, but is actually wishing to make a change. So if you think of the smoking analogy again, what you're looking at is something that increases the leverage that somebody has and the ability to make change, so that they're wishing to quit heroin, and through that they're wishing to quit injecting with its additional health complications. And Within the clinical arena, you'd have a range of therapeutic objectives. You'd be looking at somebody either quitting or at least in a major way reducing their heroin use, reducing their injecting, and you'd expect to see improvements in physical health, psychological well-being, and you'd similarly be looking for that either quitting or major reduction in criminal behaviour. I'm not going to summarise, I'm not going to go through too much of the detail of it. I'm just going to do headline stuff because I imagine most of us know this already, and just pointing to some of the spectacular examples. So the introduction of maintenance treatments in France led to massive reductions in the number of overdose deaths, heroin overdose deaths or opiate overdose deaths, when primarily buprenorphine treatment was introduced in France. In another study, if you look at Kako's study of an extreme randomized trial of buprenorphine versus placebo, not surprisingly, you get huge dropout of the group assigned to placebo. But the point I wanted to draw attention to is in this small study, when you look at the mortality rate from the two groups, you have deaths in the group who are not given active medication versus no deaths in those receiving the medication. We can also look for larger numbers and bigger analyses to Cochrane reviews, and I've just pulled out this particular one, Fagiano's review from the late 2000s, looking at in particular, there's a dose relationship. So not only do we have a treatment, but we have a treatment where there's a dose-response relationship. Better delivered, correct doses yield more of this benefit. You get benefit, however it's provided. You get more benefit if it's provided at correct dosing. And that includes, if you look at measures like mortality, the bottom one there. If we then want to look at the two big products that we have globally, they are Methadone, which has been a major player in the field for 50 years, and we have buprenorphine, which appeared as a significant product about halfway through that, about 25 years ago. And it's interesting to look at what's the differences between them. Around the world, there's different national attitudes favouring one or favouring the other. But when you look at the data altogether, so those of you who are familiar with looking at forest plots, perhaps for those of you not familiar, you need to look, first of all, at the top to check what is it that's being compared. So here we have flexible dose methadone compared with flexible dose buprenorphine. And this looks at how well do the two treatments perform in terms of retention in treatment. And if you look at the diamond near the bottom of each of the studies, that gives you the summary of the data. And if it's clearly one side or other side of the vertical line, that tells you you've got a clear, significant effect of benefit. In this case, methadone treatment being on the right-hand side here. So methadone is better at holding people in treatment. But if you look at those same studies and you look instead of holding people in treatment, whether people are giving heroin-free urines, you find that the effect, if anything, swings the other direction. So an overall conclusion might be that methadone is better at holding people in treatment, but buprenorphine is probably better at people providing negative urines, and it's a sort of swings and roundabouts observation. There were some interesting discussions between several of us in the work-up to today's meeting, this week's meeting, about there are more important things than just the medication, or there are other important things in addition to the medication. That's undoubtedly true. I'm focusing on the medication aspect in this talk, but I don't want it to be thought that I'm only viewing the medication, and we have talks later on which address those other aspects of the changes that people need to make. There's a publication in the UK from the National Institute of Clinical Excellence about psychosocial aspects of treatment in the field, which looks at how synergistically there can be benefit from the psychosocial treatment approaches alongside medication approaches. We're talking about powerful medications that deliver benefit. So let's not forget that we're from that safe position of there being huge benefit when delivered well. We also need to treat these medications with respect. So there are harms, but let's not allow that to obscure the fact that the benefits are there. But let's spend a bit of time looking at the harms. So one of the harms, and for the slides, if people are wanting to know where the studies are from, I've put the picture of the original paper in the slides so people can look at it. But in some work led by Matt Hickman in the UK, we looked at the mortality that occurred when people are in methadone treatment. We obviously don't have a baseline of their mortality from before they're in treatment, because you can't do that in a study design because they're then not in treatment. But what you see at the very beginning bit of the curve here, so over here is in the first fortnight. I can't quite do it on the other side, but anyway, in the first few weeks, you have a slight increase in mortality before somebody becomes stabilized in their treatment. Not entirely sure why that is, but it's probably some mix of their continued use of heroin in addition to starting their methadone treatment, and perhaps to do with an accumulating effects before they've reached steady state. But for whatever reason, there's a transient increased risk. This is not unknown to us in medical practice. There's all sorts of treatments. I presume that if we look at what happens when you put people on anticoagulants or whatever, those, until you have somebody stabilized, you need to be aware as a clinician, you need to watch this more carefully. But you then have the next line, that all of the time that people are within the maintenance treatment, you have this major reduction, sort of five-fold reduction in their mortality rate whilst they're in treatment. Now, the aspect that this also brought home to us, which we were not sufficiently aware of, is what happens when people eventually stop their maintenance treatments. And what you have here is a huge rebound. For the first few weeks or so, there's an increased mortality risk around the time when quite often somebody who's been in maintenance treatment is receiving the least amount of additional support because they're somehow viewed as having now finished their treatment. So important clinical take-home message from that. The other aspect to look at is the way in which the treatment's provided. We had a situation in the UK where there was minimal supervision of methadone treatment, and this undoubtedly accounted for why we had methadone deaths from our lack of monitoring of the treatment. We introduced supervised consumption, and we then went back a few years later to look at, did that change in our practice lead to less methadone-related deaths? And we saw this huge reduction, both in Scotland and in England, once supervised consumption was introduced. The other area that I think it's wise for us to pay attention to is that whilst I'm summarizing for you how successfully methadone and buprenorphine can enable people to bring about major changes, there are also a large number of patients who are not held in treatment in a way that they stay in treatment. So let's look at the survival curves of people staying in treatment. This graph actually compares methadone and buprenorphine. So it shows what we were talking about a little bit earlier, that methadone performs slightly better than buprenorphine in holding people in treatment. But let's put that aside for a moment and look at this part of the curve to the top. So both of these treatments are losing a third to a half of their patients by 6 months. And this is meant to be a long-term treatment. So therefore, we need to pause and reflect on the fact that whilst there is huge benefit delivered by the treatment, there's a large number of the patient population who are no longer benefiting or no longer staying in the treatment that is meant to be a long-term treatment. So that's an area we don't pay enough attention to. And that leads one on to then say, well, could there be other candidate opiate maintenance treatments? And the ways in which we might think about different opiates are, so here's two PK graphs where they have the same amount of drug absorbed, but the effect from the patient would be hugely different. One being a sort of a markedly discernible effect at the front end, and the other having a slower onset of effect. And what we have now is the emergence of medications where there's attention to the liberation of the drug. So in what way does the drug become available to the body? So that would either be the use of prodrugs, where the drug itself is not active, but the metabolite is what is the active medication, or it might be from the physical formulation, which actually creates a slow release of the drug. So either ordinary slow release tablets or higher technology things like Oros technologies for this. One of the striking examples, and it's very appropriate to be talking about this in Austria, would be sustained release or slow release oral morphine. Austria being a country where slow-release morphine has had a position similar to the position that methadone and buprenorphine have had in many other countries. And we now, so just to guide you through some of the, why would one consider a slow-release morphine? Well, if you look at the plasma concentrations, they're just about as flat as you're getting with methadone, so that looks encouraging. If you look at the effect on pupil size as a sort of measure of opiate effect, it's at least as good as methadone in terms of stabilizing the opiate effect. If you look at the manifestation of withdrawal symptoms to people in treatment when they're either on methadone or slow-release morphine, here again you get an encouragingly flatter curve from the morphine. So from Austria and now from other countries as well, you have the proper study of slow-release morphine as a serious candidate drug alongside methadone and buprenorphine. I mentioned that the way in which you might have a long duration of action might be from a physical form of just having a capsule that causes slow release, but it might also be from a prodrug where the drug that's given has little effect itself, but the metabolite would be valuable. And in these data from a while back from Australia, when LAM was still around as a drug, you look at this and you think, gosh, so just the medication itself is associated with different retention rates. That's something we should be paying much more attention to. If it was my brother or sister or son or daughter who was going into treatment, and I knew that one treatment had 37% retention versus another having 59%, I'd want to know that difference. And as a clinician, I'd want to be more aware of it. So you're beginning to have medications with very different sort of effects. So here you've got a 48-hour, 72-hour duration of effect with a very flat effect because it's the metabolite that's the main psychoactive drug. Now, we don't have that drug available to us anymore because of concerns that there were about cardiac complications. But if we think of the concept of wanting to have medications in that zone, then that's probably what we should be thinking about for future medications. Yeah, I forgot that I had those slides. And actually here again, there was evidence of a dose-response relationship. So not only was there benefit there, but you find that there's more benefit when the dose is more correct. Final few talks, and in a way this sets the scene for Evgeny's talk in a few minutes about antagonists, but just a few moments to mention and make sure people are aware of, we actually have implants and depot agonists. Now, the work thus far has only involved buprenorphine, but for a number of years now there's been research ongoing into probufene, or a buprenorphine implant, where little rods about the size of matchsticks are inserted that slowly leak buprenorphine over 6 months. And so instead of getting this sawtooth effect of your daily dosing, you get this flat plateau release from the implanted rod of buprenorphine, and this is being studied at the moment. And there's also depot injection versions of it, which are also currently being studied. Now, what's interesting about this that we need to steer the consideration of it is the different way in which this might interact with both treatment and people's recovery. It's going to be associated with a very different treatment organizational system compared with the structure and routine associated with methadone and buprenorphine prescribing. The final area to mention is around injectable agonists, mainly injectable heroin treatment. Whilst this has been seen certainly in public debate and political debate as very controversial, it's actually a very straightforward clinical research consideration. We know we have a small number of entrenched heroin addict patients who all other treatments seem not to have worked with, and from a number of countries, particularly around Europe and Canada, there's now been impressive series of high-quality studies looking at where oral maintenance treatment has failed and other treatment approaches have failed. Can you achieve the quitting of street heroin use from a strictly supervised, on the premises, supervised injectable heroin treatment? And there's a number of papers. I'm just going to show you one set of slides, if I can. So this set of slides was of this patient population whom you might regard as a patient population considered untreatable. So the exciting clinical challenge is there a way in which you can treat a population up to that point regarded as beyond an ability to be able to treat them? So they were randomized to 3 different treatment groups you had, and I'll quickly whiz you through to the 3rd treatment group. But so this was what proportion of urine specimens people were giving that were negative for their street heroin use, where you can see with methadone, we have a small number of people who are managing to from the more intensive program that they were involved with. Injectable methadone, which we studied, was slightly better, but pretty similar. But with the supervised heroin treatment, within 4 to 6 weeks, we were seeing major changes, with more than half of them providing negative urine specimens for street heroin. Okay, one concluding slide, is it, or two? Yeah, my concluding slide. Perhaps one of the really important facts that we need to take away is that we are looking at this area as something that we can bring benefit from a medicine and care approach, quite separate from debates about law and control. We we need to be clear what a powerful evidence base we have for effective maintenance treatments in the opiate field. And the opiate field and the nicotine smoking field are the two areas where we've got extremely strong evidence of benefit. These can be improved further by blending them with what I've called here co-therapies or co-interventions, which we'll talk about in other sessions. But we really owe it to the field to look at whether we should seek to have more diversity of products, so that, you know, whilst it was a huge step forward to go from only having methadone to having methadone and buprenorphine, you know, I really do feel in 50 years we should have been able to make more progress than going from 1 to 2. And any other field would have made that more progress. And finally, you know, we need to harness these individual and public benefits, you know, not only for the individuals we see, but for wider society. And there is an issue about basic human rights of access to treatments of proven effectiveness. So thank you very much.